This is the 1600cc twin cam for my Alfa Romeo Duetto project. I hauled it out of the car back in January after starting it up for the first time in 30 years, and it rattled like it was on the brink of death. I put this engine together towards the end of last year, building it up as a standard 1600 Spider engine with a couple of upgrades to the fuel and ignition system. So it should have been an easy build, right? The first thing I did when I got this engine back on the stand was pull the cylinder head off, and immediately the issue became pretty apparent. The inlet valves were just touching the valve pocket on the pistons, on all 4 pistons, but on number 4 it was worse than others. Number 4 had a fair amount of metal rubbed away on the inside of the valve pocket. It was like the valve wasn't hitting the top of the piston, it was like grazing the edge of the valve pocket, as if the valves in the pockets were misaligned. The valves were striking slightly lower than they should have been, and that explained that knocking noise that the engine was giving off while it ran for all of 5 minutes. What I couldn't quite figure out was why the valves were touching. Everything was standard 1600 stuff. Standard pistons, standard valves, standard cams. But I had an idea. A very common issue on Alfa 105 engines is failure of the second main bearing. Of the 5 main bearings, only 3 have their own oil feeds, 1, 3, and 5. Bearings 2 and 4 get their oil from the crank. If you don't maintain the engine right and run with low oil or over-rev the engine, the number 2 main bearing will be the first to fail. Alfa 105 race cars usually have oil passages drilled into the number 2 and number 4 main bearings to prevent this. So on a car that's had a careless owner, a really common problem is a spun second main bearing. This is where the bearing loses its oil supply and gets super hot and sticks to the crankshaft. The bearing shells then spin with the crank and damage the bearing shell surface inside the block. This is where the issue with this block lies. I think that at some point in its long and quite hard life, it has spun its second main bearing. Now, the correct thing to do when this happens to an Alfa 105 block is to weld up the damaged bearing surface and then have it remachined back to standard using a method called line boring. But what happened to this block was that it was line bored without being welded, meaning that the damaged metal on the bearing surface was removed, leaving a smooth new surface for the bearing. But obviously it wasn't only the second main bearing surface that was machined out, it was all of them. This caused quite a few problems, the main one being that the crank now sits higher in the block than it did originally. After taking a bunch of measurements from a standard 1600 block, I found the difference to be about 0.4 millimeters, or 15 thousandths of an inch. Another issue this causes is that the main oil seals of the engine are no longer concentric with the crankshaft, as well as the transmission alignment being out as well. I also measured the thickness of the cylinder head and got a measurement of 111.5 millimeters, which is half a millimeter off standard, which is fine. It's within spec. However, with this engine, when combined with the 0.4 millimeters of the crank moving up, the valves and pistons were now too close together. Another problem with line boring in this way is that it increases the compression ratio of the cylinder. High compression pistons aren't an issue if you're building a high performance engine with cams and other modifications to match, but high compression on a standard cam isn't a great idea. So where does this leave me with this engine build? This is this car's original 1600cc 00536 series engine block, and it would be a shame to not try and save it. If this wasn't this car's original engine, I might say it's not worth trying to fix it. I mean, it's not far off because it ran before. It didn't run well, but it ran. So it can't be that far off from getting it back to running well. I should be able to get this to run again and even be smooth and reliable, although I'm sure it's going to take a fair amount of work above and beyond what a standard engine build would take. I'm going to put this engine back together, and if it isn't good, if it isn't smooth and reliable, and if it drops oil and stuff like that, then I will think about possibly replacing it with a different engine block. And we can make a decision whether that's a different 1600 block, do I try and find another 00536 block, or do we go to a 1750 or something like that. But for now, I'm going to try and save the original block. All of that said, I know that this engine will never be an engine that could be built to be highly strung. Like, it will never have high compression pistons and big cams and big valves and stuff like that. That will never happen unless somebody goes to the insane process of welding it all up and machining it back to standard and putting like new head studs and stuff in it. But it's not going to be me. I'm not going to do that. But I do think it'll be a fairly good standard 1600 road car engine. It should be fine. Obviously, they're going to have to be a lot of videos about this process, doing all the non-standard stuff to make this work. So I hope that answers all your questions about this engine. And I'll be doing quite a few videos over the next 2 weeks about the process of putting this back together. Now, it's entirely my fault that this engine didn't work out the way I wanted it to, because I thought, sometimes when you're building a standard engine, you take for granted that you're going to have correct clearances and things like that, but sometimes this sort of thing does happen. So, yeah. So I don't have anyone to blame except myself for the fact that I'm doing all this work and more over again. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to be worth it, and this engine's going to be a good one. So keep an eye on the channel for more episodes about this engine. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.